Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Ben here, and today I am going to be doing a video talking about the 2006 to 2007 season for the Golden State Warriors and a little bit about the Dallas Mavericks. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the playoff series between the two in 2007 in the first round of the playoffs. And I'm going to just give a little more in-depth information because I feel like that's often cited as a great upset in NBA history, and I want to just go back and look at some facts and talk a little bit about it and maybe why it isn't such a big upset, and maybe try and identify some of the main reasons why this upset happened in the first place. So I'm going to just start off with a little bit of background. The Golden State Warriors were the 8th seed in the 2007 playoffs. They finished the regular season at 42-40, and the Dallas Mavericks were 67-15 in the regular season with the best record in the NBA, and they finished as the #1 seed in the Western Conference. So these teams played a series against each other in the first round, obviously the 1 versus the 8 seed, and the Warriors won in 6 games, and it was a big shock to the entire world. One of the only times that that an 8 seed has beaten a 1 seed in the playoffs. And then they went on to the second round and lost to the Utah Jazz in 5 games. But they were able to pull off one of the biggest upsets in NBA history, or that's at least what most people say. And today I'm going to not debunk that entirely, but just sort of explain why it happened, because it was sort of at the time seen as this miracle, but I think that there's a lot more clear reasoning behind why it happened, rather than just saying, oh, it's a miracle and going with that, because I think if you look at it on paper, it makes a lot more sense how they were able, it makes a lot more sense that they were able to beat them when you look at all the facts surrounding the scenario. So I'm going to start with talking about the first reason why I think the Warriors were able to beat the Mavericks, and that is that they had a very different regular season than they had when they got into the playoffs. What I mean by this is that the team that they had during the regular season was vastly different than who they had during the playoffs. They had a lot of players injured. So, for instance, their best player this year was Baron Davis, and let's see, he missed 20 games during the regular season, which was big for the team. Missing your best player for 20 games is always a big deal, especially in a crowded Western Conference when even missing a few games can cost you a place in the standings. Along with this, you would argue that their second best player was Jason Richardson at the time, who missed 30 games during the regular season. And then they had a huge roster shakeup as well, in that they traded Mike Dunleavy, who was about their 6th man, and a few other rotation players to the Indiana Pacers, and in return they got Al Harrington and Steven Jackson, both two competent players who were very good at the time, really good quality starters, not stars, but just good rotation players that can help a good team out. So on top of having to get these guys healthy and get them integrated back into the rotation, referring to Baron Davis and Jason Richardson, they also were at the same time having to integrate Al Harrington and Steven Jackson into the team, both when those players were out and then integrating all of them back together when everybody was healthy and together. And so they struggled a lot during the regular season, but they finished strong in April. They were 8-1 in the final month of the season because they had finally gotten everyone back together and they were starting to really gel. But their whole season they were a little discombobulated in that they had a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different lineups because of the injuries and the trades. And so I don't think that the regular season properly reflects the talent level of this team, because their main pieces were injured for significant portions of the season. And 2 of the guys that were huge to the playoff run were not on the team until the trade deadline itself. So, but when you look at this team on paper and you look at some of their statistics, it really makes sense why they did better in the playoffs than people thought, because Baron Davis was averaging 20 points and 8 assists a game. Al Harrington averaged 17 points and 6 rebounds a game. Let's see here. Steven Jackson averaged 17 points a game. Jason Richardson averaged 16 points a game. Monte Ellis averaged 17 points a game. And off the bench, Mikael Pietrus sort of as a sixth man and occasionally filling in when Richardson was injured. He averaged 11 points a game, a good wing defender who can just knock down some three-point shots and be a 3-and-D guy. And they also had Matt Barnes, who is a notorious tough guy. He averaged around 9 or 10 points a game and had 5 rebounds to go along with it. And then as their starting center, they had Andres Biedrins, who averaged around 10 points and 9 rebounds a game. And so that sort of rounds out their key players on their team. And so I guess if you look back at that real quick, you had 5 guys who could average 16 or more points a game, and then good rotation players like Pietrus, Barnes, and Biedrins. So I think that really makes a lot of sense why they would do well in the playoffs, because a team with that many guys that can score is obviously going to do really well. And I think if we would have seen a full regular season with this exact roster, they would not have finished 42-40. And if they would have all been healthy, I think that they could be in the more range of around 50 to 55 wins, because I think if they would have had the time to get the chemistry down better with the 2 new pieces, and if Richardson and Baron Davis hadn't missed any time, that they would be a much better team than they were. And so actually, if you look at the standings that year, let's say that they just win 50 games, that puts them, or even 51, that puts them around the 5 seed, and they would have matched up with the Jazz in the first round. Now, yes, the Jazz beat them in the second round of these playoffs, but I think that honestly, they could take the Jazz in the first round if they had this team together for the whole season and they really knew each other well. I think that they would have been fine taking down the Jazz in the first round. So that's my first reason for why it shouldn't be as surprising as it was that the Warriors beat the Mavericks, is that the Warriors were actually a lot better than their record showed, and it's really because of a trade that they needed to integrate their parts and their chemistry was off for a while. And then secondly, because of the huge injuries that they had with their arguably 2 best players, or their best player and their tied for second best player, missing significant portions of the season. That is why their record was worse than it was. But really, I think that they were a top 4 or 5 team in the West if everyone was healthy for the whole season. So moving on to my second reason that the Warriors beat the Mavericks in the playoffs is because the Warriors and the style that they played matched up really well with the Mavericks and how they played. So if you look at the Warriors, they have their starting lineup would look like Baron Davis, Jason Richardson at shooting guard, Steven Jackson at small forward, Al Harrington at power forward, Biedrins at center, and then off the bench you'd have Monte Ellis as the 6th man, and then Mikael Pietrus and Matt Barnes. And sometimes they'd run a small ball lineup, but most of the time it was what I just described. And if you look at all those guys that were the high scoring leaders, Baron Davis is one of the low guys, and him and Monte Ellis averaged around 30. Well, Baron Davis averaged 30% from the 3-point line. Monte Ellis averaged 27. But then you look at Al Harrington, who shot 42% from the 3-point line at a stretch 4. And you see Steven Jackson averaged 34% as a small forward. Jason Richardson averaged 37%. Mikael Pietrus 39%. Matt Barnes 37%. So they had a good amount of outside shooting on their team, and I think that matched up really favorably with Dallas. Not because Dallas didn't have a lot of shooting on their team, but because they played a very traditional 1 point guard, 2 wings, power forward, and a center, whereas the Warriors played more of a what we might call modern style, where they were running and gunning a lot more than the Mavericks were, and they were spreading the floor a lot more. Yes, the Mavericks had Dirk and had Jason Terry and guys that are really good at 3-point shooting, but then they had guys like Eric Dampier, who was almost an offensive liability at this point in his career and could not really shoot from the outside much at all. I mean, he could not really shoot a shot outside of the paint, really, and he was just really slow, really bulky guy, and he just couldn't keep up with the pace of the game, really, honestly, especially when the Warriors were really trying to push the ball with all these wing players on the floor. You know, at a certain time, they would even play with Baron Davis, Monta Ellis, Jason Richardson, Jackson, and Al Harrington, sort of a small ball lineup on the floor, and then they could really run and gun because all those guys were very athletic and fast. And so when you match that up with the Mavericks, who Dirk isn't super athletic, so he's a bit slower. Eric Dampier is extremely slow as their starting center. That really hurt them in defending and getting back in transition defense as opposed to the Warriors. And then if you just look at the Warriors, how they had so many guys who could be reliable scoring. So like let's say on a given night, Jason Richardson and Monta Ellis are off as far as scoring. You still had Al Harrington, Baron Davis, and Steven Jackson who could all pick up the slack, and Petrus off the bench too. Whereas for the Mavericks, I feel like they were slightly more top-heavy in that if Dirk didn't really have it going, then they looked to Jason Terry, and if he didn't really have it going, then they were a bit up a creek without a paddle, in that those two handled most of the offense. And they did have Josh Howard too, who was a good player and could put it in the hole, but he was used to being the third option and not having the ball in his hands all the time and sort of working off the other two. So when if those two were to not do great, he wouldn't be able to work off them and get his offensive as much. So that's an area where if you look at their depth of scoring, and the Mavericks trying to keep up with the Warriors' hyperactive scoring, they can't do it as much because they only have about 3 guys who can score well as opposed to the Warriors having 5. So I think that was a big difference as well. And I'm just going to pull up the Mavericks team stats here for the season. And alright, here we go. So for the regular season, you had Dirk averaging 25, Josh Howard averaging 19, and Jason the Jet Terry averaging 17, and nobody else really averaging that many notable numbers. Devin Harris 10 a game, Jerry Stackhouse, who missed a portion of the season, averaging 12 a game. But really it's those top 3 who are the guys that are being counted on. Eric Dampier averaging 7 points a game and 7 rebounds. So he was really a big problem just overall for this team. Like they had a complete team except for him. He was really weighing them down, I'd say, not to be mean to him, but just that's how I feel about it. Okay, so that's my second reason, essentially, is just that I think that the Warriors and their style of play matched up really well with the Mavericks and their style of play, and I think we got a small preview in that even in the regular season, the Warriors swept the season series from the Mavericks, so they were confident that they could beat them, and they had beaten them during the regular season, which actually bleeds a bit into our third reason why the Warriors beat the Mavericks, which is that I think that the Warriors from their regular season victories were very confident, and I think the Mavericks were almost overlooking the Warriors and more looking towards like a deep playoff run to get revenge for losing in the finals the year before. So they weren't really thinking about the Warriors as a legitimate threat to them, and they were just, I don't want to say going through the motions, but not really giving it their full effort at first. And then the Warriors came out and beat them in Game 1, and I think the Mavericks realized that they had to try a lot harder, but it almost might have been too late at that point because the Warriors really had a lot of momentum, and I think we're at a large disadvantage or a large advantage as far as psyche and mentality and beating them psychologically. I think the Mavericks weren't really ready for a big battle in round 1, and because of that, I think they were taken off guard, and the Warriors were not going to let up, and the Mavericks just honestly didn't prepare for them how they should have. And along with this, the Mavericks played really poorly. They kind of go hand in hand, obviously. So Dirk Nowitzki went from shooting 50% and 25 points a game. He went down to, in the playoffs, shooting, let's see here. He shot 38% and only scored a little under 20 points a game. So that's a big fall off. Josh Howard actually stepped up his game. He went from averaging 19 points a game to 21. His shooting was, let's see here. Shooting was similar. He went up a bit. He went from 46% to 50%. And Jason Terry in the regular season averaged 17 on 48% shooting, and in the playoffs he dipped that to 42% shooting and he was still getting 17 points a game, but just on worse efficiencies. And then you had a guy like Jerry Stackhouse trying to step up, but his field goal percentage was putrid in this series. He was getting more about 44% during the regular season, and it went down to 35% in the playoffs. He's always been a volume scorer, but it wasn't what the Mavericks needed in this series because he was just shooting the ball awfully. Even though his scoring average did go up a little bit, he was taking way more shots and doing a worse job, so it didn't really help the team because his percentage was way down. So yeah, guys, that's a little bit about the Mavericks in general and the Warriors in that series. So when I look back at this series, I don't see as much of a shock because when I look at everything on paper, this Warriors team, just looking up and down the roster and the numbers, they look pretty good. And it would have been cool to see them have a little bit of a longer run. They really were only together for this playoff run and didn't really get a full season together afterwards because, again, injuries broke them up and stuff like that. But to sum up, I think the first reason that the Warriors were able to beat the Mavericks and why people should not be as shocked as they are is because during the regular season, the Warriors had a lot of injuries to deal with and then had to integrate players via trade, which if they're really important players, that can really shake up the chemistry of your team. So they didn't really get their act together until the playoffs actually started as far as chemistry. So that's number one. Number two is that their styles of play really favored the Warriors in that the Mavericks weren't able to keep up with them offensively. And then the Mavericks also failed as far as adapting. They kept Eric Dampier on the court, which did not help. And so their styles of play just heavily favored the Warriors. And then number three, the Mavs underestimated the Warriors completely, and the Warriors were supremely confident because of their regular season sweep. And the Mavericks honestly just played awfully compared to how they did during the regular season. And so yeah, that's it, guys. I hope you learned a little bit something if you didn't know much about this series. It's a very interesting nugget of NBA history. It's an amazing series. If you ever want to go back and watch some of the games, it's just shocking to see an 8 seed pulling all this stuff off. Hope you guys enjoyed the video again, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.